about the law of karma. And each tradition has something like that, some expression of what happens when you don't observe basic ethics. And each tradition has advice on how to live a good life. We already said in Buddhism it's the Eightfold Path. Islam has 5 pillars. I want to say what those are. We all need to be literate about Islam. What is Islam? What does it teach? The first pillar is there is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. That's the first pillar of Islam. The second pillar is prayers, 5 times a day, facing toward the Kaaba in Mecca. The third pillar we've just heard about or read about recently, probably fasting during Ramadan is the third pillar. The fourth pillar is almsgiving. A lot of the traditions have this as one of their ethical recommendations that we give to those in need. And the fifth pillar is pilgrimage to Mecca. And I think most of us have heard about that too. In Taoism, it's living in accord with the Tao. It's living in accord with the principle behind all that exists. And again, that harmony thing that I said about indigenous traditions, because I really see that Taoism as an indigenous tradition. In Judaism, it's following the law and all the recommendations for prayer. In Christianity, first of all, it's faith. First of all, it's faith. How to live a good life by faith, and then following Jesus' teachings. And you can begin with the Beatitudes. That's a good place to begin, to live a good life in Christian teaching. In Hinduism, there's lots of different paths. Hinduism is, I think, a wonderful tradition because it's so multiple. There's lots and lots and lots and lots of branches of Hinduism, lots and lots and lots of imagery of the divine, and also there's lots of paths. And part of that is because, again, it's an indigenous tradition, I think. It arose really among the earliest traditions of humanity, and probably the earliest that's still practiced in the same way today outside of what we usually consider the indigenous traditions. And so there are lots of paths. Good works, holiness, devotion. The heart of it really is dharma, or good behavior. Every tradition has some form of afterlife. Everybody knows about heaven. Pagans call it the summer land. In Taoism, most forms of Taoism, it's immortality. Buddhism, nirvana. Everybody knows about nirvana. So lots and lots and lots of common ground between the religions. I saw the sign finally. How long have you been holy? Fortunately, maybe not too long. The similarities all point to common human truths. And they're recognizable by those of other traditions. You can listen to another tradition's expression of the golden rule and say, that's really, really similar to how my tradition says it. But their unique qualities also invite appreciation by the others. The things that are different, they are different. You've already said that. All the religions are different. The fact is that religions have adopted and adapted attributes from the other religions throughout their histories. And I think that shows their appreciation of the other's paths. For example, Christianity adopted the pagan Will of the Year holidays and adapted them to Christian purposes. They don't mean the same thing in Christianity, but they're the same dates, or they were before we moved the calendar a little bit. But they adopted those holidays. Otherwise, we'd still be celebrating Jewish holidays as Christians. Christianity adopted Judaism's scriptures, and we hold those to be true as well. And Islam also shares the Bible and looks at it in a different way than Christianity looks at Judaism. But Islam also adopted the other religions' scriptures. Buddhism has roots in Hinduism. Indigenous traditions borrow freely from each other and from the other faiths. You can see that if you study any of those. And I think mystics in every tradition appreciate the other people's expressions. And this is my one place to wave my book because it's not about what this talk is about. But I made a study of the mystic Julian of Norwich, who really, she's not living in an interfaith world, except that in her day, 14th century England, she was Catholic. Everyone in the West was Catholic who was Christian at that time. But there were 3 popes during her lifetime. So there was already some major dissent going on there. Mystics appreciate other mystics in all the traditions around the world. And I can't give examples because I don't have time, but I don't think acknowledging another's path diminishes our own in any way. And that's where we part company, right? That's where the yes and the no on this question differ. Looking at the multiplicity of religious traditions, at what they hold in common, and at what is unique, it makes sense to me, where I stand, to answer yes to this question. Not just from one point of view, but from the point of view of each religious tradition. I think you could argue the yes position from all of these traditions. Thank you.
We are now going to have 10 minutes rebuttal by each speaker. We're going to begin with Dr. Miles.
Thank you. It's an interesting thing to be sitting there trying to take notes and to conceive of what you're going to say based upon what you don't know the other person is going to say until you hear it. I would happily agree. Are we loud enough? Okay. I would happily agree that there is a cultural richness to the various. There is a cultural richness to the various religious traditions of the world. I would join you in arguing that. Furthermore, I would join you in agreeing that there are some significant similarities. Now, for me, I would point to our like creation as image bearers, our common ancestry with Adam. I think those are biblical responses, and they make sense to me. So I would, quite frankly, expect that there would be similarities amongst the different religions, especially when it comes to ethics, because God is the creator of all. He's not just the creator of the Jewish people, and He has created the world to work in certain ways. However, the main argument that was presented to us just now was a fairly common argument for pluralists, and it was arguing by what I'll call reductionism. And reductionism is employed when the claim is made that the major religions are equally valid, because ultimately, when you boil it down, they teach the same thing. But once you peel away perhaps the non-essentials of each particular religion, especially when it comes to virtue, especially when it comes to ethics, they all teach a like thing. And for me, what I wanted to suggest to you is that this is it's a valid thing to look and begin to peel away the different parts if all you want to do is arrive at what do these have in common. But when you do that, what I would suggest to you is that you have reduced each religion into just a parody of what it actually is. If you begin to peel away all of the things that makes Christianity distinct until you get down to what might be a lowest common denominator for all the religions of the world, some basic ethical practices, you don't arrive at any one particular religion at all, but you arrive at what for all the world to me seems like a watered down version of Buddhism that really no self-respecting Buddhist would appreciate. In a truly pluralistic system, Christianity, along with Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, among others, they have to be seen as great religious faiths, as a stream of religious life that leads invariably to some sort of ultimate reality. The Christians, we choose to call that God the Father, but in order to fit Christianity in this pluralist agenda, to enable Christianity and then even the other religions of the world to coexist intellectually, I think what you have to do is you have to deny the very essence of Christianity. You have to intentionally discard, you have to eliminate every distinctive Christian doctrine that makes Christianity historically identity-giving and identity-preserving. And so I would suggest to you that if you're sitting here tonight claiming to be Christian, but thinking that Buddhism is a legitimate path to the God you worship, then you have not thought very well, or you don't understand Christianity, because what you've done is you've engaged in a pro-Christian reduction. You're left with perhaps some ethical teachings that may or may not be attributed to Jesus, depending on if you took some religion classes here at Oregon State University. But little else resembling Orthodox historical Christianity. And quite frankly, the same could be said for Islam or Hinduism or Buddhism. I mean, perhaps the most famous proponent of religious pluralism, John Hick, he has trimmed more and more off the religious understandings of God. He's come to the point where he can't even refer to God as God. First, God as the real. Kind of sounds a little bit like calling God the divine, so as not to offend. And the pluralists zeal to find commonality between the religions. It's not Christianity or any other religion, for that matter, that's related to the other world faiths, but little more than a parody. As I said before, it's just a caricature of the living faith. It's based more on the presuppositions of 21st century non-Christian Westerners than on any sort of historical reality at all. As I said at the beginning, the identity of Christianity is inextricably linked to the uniqueness of Jesus Christ. All that he taught, all that he claimed, and all that he did. I have another concern, at the risk of sounding too colloquial here. I mean, who died and left religious pluralists in charge of evaluating the truth claims of other religions? I mean, it's ironic that in this postmodern age of tolerance, religious pluralists have they've established themselves as the evaluators of the truth claims of other religions. I mean, what's the vantage point that privileges their judgments? On the basis of this model, it's not their individual religions that have access to truth. Ultimately, it's the Western religious pluralists. They're deciding what's a legitimate path to God and what's not. As long as you don't say anything distinctive about who you think God actually is, as long as you don't engage in peripheral debates like, does God exist or does he not exist? What's the nature of salvation? Who is God personal or is he not? These trivial things, then of course all paths lead to this watered down sort of thing. I mean, why should we accept that definition? My wife is not here with me tonight. She's with our two young children at home. Imagine if in my quest to know her, I made up facts about her and pursued her on the basis of my own speculation. I might even have admirable motives for doing so. Obviously, my wife, though, would have very little appreciation for this effort. In fact, she'd probably feel dishonored that I had actually ignored the reality of her being and chose to pursue her on the basis of my own speculations, my own cultural presuppositions, my own desires, what I like and what I don't like. After all, my wife is a real person, and as such, I can actually be right about her and I can be wrong about her. And why would we expect God to be any different? I mean, I worry that when we pick and choose of what of God we like and what of God we don't like, what of God we want to believe, what of God we don't want to believe, that we're engaging in idolatry creating. We're creating a God in our own image. But God's not an image that I create. God is not a thing that a culture creates. Cultures can be wrong. Is that not self-evident that not all cultures are equal? That there are some things in our Pacific Northwest culture that are very admirable compared to other cultures of the world, and there are probably some things about our Pacific Northwest culture that are not admirable at all. God is real. He exists independently of all that he created. God is not a part of creation. God is a being who exists independently of my efforts to reach him or describe him. God has an existence in and of himself, and he doesn't derive that existence from culture. He doesn't derive that existence from what I think about him or what I don't. My thoughts of him are either true in that they relate rightly to him, or they are false. At the risk of oversimplification, God is who he is, regardless of how or what I think about him. I don't think God into existence, nor do I have the right to pick and choose what I like about him. And there are some very intriguing cultural ideas about who God might be, but if it doesn't cohere with who God actually is, then it's wrong. It's wrong. It doesn't matter how devout or how pious I am in that quest. When I've done something like that, what is worshipped? It's not a real transcendent God, but it's an avatar. It's a virtual God of my own making, a God that I virtually worship. The Bible indicates that the supreme God is dishonored when we approach him on our terms or by means of our own choosing. To suggest otherwise would fly in the face of simple logic. and also the biblical story.